I'm gonna kind of jump around a little bit today. Might go over some of the questions that were on homework 4. Probably do a little bit. I've got some papers that I think I'm gonna talk about, and then maybe try to think through one of the topics someone brought up last week, related to the draft. So I will let's go home. I should be able to start this afternoon, get a pretty good chunk through those homeworks and get those graded. I'll also put up the 5th and final homework. So what I'm gonna do is that homework will be due the Friday before finals. So basically these next 2 weeks. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna end up dropping the lowest homework. So you've done the first 4 and you're happy with your grade, or you're okay with your grade there. You don't have to do the 5th one because the 0 would be your lowest and it gets dropped. If you had one that you missed or you didn't do so well on, you can kind of complete this 5th assignment, replace that lowest grade. If it's a 0, they'll help you a lot, or replace it at your lowest grade if you didn't do so well on one of the other ones, right? So this 5th Excel assignment this 5th homework assignment will have a little bit more kind of regression heavy, like interpretation of coefficients. Thinking about if I want to estimate certain relationships, what variables might I want to choose. So those, try to have some of that, more of that on the final. So I want that 5th Excel assignment. Once it is that due date is passed, you'll have that for finals week to look at, and I'll have the answer key up there to study for that. Also, once I finish grading the 4th homeworks, I'll also put up an answer key for that as well. I'm going to hold off because inevitably sometimes someone has a corrupt file or something ends up happening. So I'm not going to put that on until I kind of get those graded. Okay. Any other questions before we kind of jump into things here today? Yeah. What's the date for the process? I don't remember. So is that the early date or is that the final date? The early date was like a. All right, so I can adjust that because I don't mind giving you guys a little extra time for this. Let me see, what did I have sit out here? 21st. Yeah, so since we have a little bit smaller of a class, if you guys, I'll give you another week. As long as you turn it in by the next Friday, I'll be okay with that. If you get them turned in earlier, I can probably start grading them and kind of getting that factor into your grade. You can kind of see a little bit more how that's going to influence it. But yeah, I waited and moved a little bit. I'm fine with you guys for the week. You should have plenty of time to grade this. So it's like a little bit smaller class than you would have. I'll put an announcement on Canvas. So I'm glad you asked that out. Put an announcement on Canvas. This will be what, the 28th? It's next Friday. So I'm gonna have it due at the end of next week. Okay. Any questions? We jump in and things here. So that should make it a little bit easier. You got that project. If you don't have to do that 5th homework, you can if you have extra time. I know how the end of semesters get. It's just like just a lot going on, right? So I'll also get up some practice exams. So obviously we're a little bit further out from the, probably when you're trying to start studying, but I'll just get them up there so that you can kind of start taking a look as we get closer to that exam date. Okay. Any other questions from you before you? Yeah.
Is the exam or the final gonna be like a set time frame, or is it like gonna be?
Yeah, so I'm gonna have it whenever I have it in the syllabus here. Whenever the university assigned time slot is, so it'll be Wednesday at noon for us. Yep. It'll probably look pretty similar to the take home I gave you, but because it's only 2 hours, I'll probably make the difficulty of it a little bit easier. But it will still be some mixture of like 10 multiple choice and then kind of like a homework assignment, like 3 or 4 short answer with a couple multiple parts, maybe some. Good question. And I'll give a more specific number on the exact number of multiple choice and short answer as we get closer to that date and then have it kind of finalized. But it's going to be roughly that. Any other questions? All right, so where do I want to start? I think I'm going to start with this paper, and then we will kind of move towards doing a little bit of review of some of the homework problems. So I put this up on Canvas. I think I called it like Wonderlic, discrimination or something like that. So anybody know what the Wonderlic scores they use in football? Ever heard of it?
Is that like a cognitive ability test?
Yeah, it's like so the military uses something called the ASVAB. And then we've got, I'm making sure I was recording this. We've got like SATs, ACT. It's essentially that, right? It's trying to get some measure of cognitive ability. But I think that it relies, if I remember correctly, it relies a little bit more on speed of which you can answer. And so it's supposed to evaluate decision making, this decision making ability from players. So this paper had the idea. Let me see. I know they have I thought they had an equation down here. Here we go. So it's generally only used for incoming kind of quarterbacks or incoming players to the NFL, right? And so this paper had this thought of like, is the draft position impacted by the score? Because there's a lot of scouts and people that will talk about it and yeah, they look good, their tape looks good, but their Wonderlic score was so low, right? So they kind of said, okay, what's going to be the impact of performance on that Wonderlic score on your draft position? And I said, is there a difference, right, for black versus non-black players, right? So we've talked about this before, where if I want to know the effect of something, and I think that it might vary across groups, what I can do is take that variable and interact it with an indicator or a 1-0 variable for whatever that group is. So if I were to pick up, I'll kind of write this out here. So here they had kind of draft position. And I'll write this out. I don't know why they use all these goofy gray. I always just say keep it beta and then number them. But here we kind of had that Wonderlic score. They had whether or not the player was black. This is just a 1-0 variable. And then this interaction term with what their score was on that test. And then that 1-0 variable. Right? So beta 1 here tells me the expected increase in draft position from 1 more point on this test, right? But because I've included this interaction term, this is actually the effect of 1 more point on the test across every race, right? The average kind of impact. Beta 3, the coefficient on that interaction term, is the additional effect or the additional increase or decrease, right? I guess we don't truly know the sign until we run this regression in draft position from 1 more point, right? So you can kind of think about this interaction coefficient is telling you, yeah, there is some effect that this one, scoring 1 point better on the Wonderlic score test has, but it might actually impact black athletes by even more, right? Maybe beta 3 isn't even a positive value, right? So that 1 more point in the Wonderlic test for a black athlete is beta 1 plus beta 3, right? It's the additional impact. Well, if we have anything that we can say is different from 0 here, I don't want to say it's necessarily, it might be evidence. We don't have all the control variables in here yet, but it could be evidence of discrimination, right? Or at the very least, these two groups are being treated differently, right? They're being evaluated based off of, where we see them being drafted. If we think that draft position is a reflection of where, where the players or the teams value these players, that kind of whether or not they're black and that interaction with that performance in the test isn't impacting one group more than the other. So let's look at their results. It's a pretty short paper, really. This is not what I wanted. Oh, you can go here. So this is like their very basic regression. So you can kind of say things like, this is my draft position, right? So I believe they did the inverse of this, so the interpretation is easier, right? Because usually you think about something like if I do better, if I do this is. If I do worse, I should be that. Yeah, actually, they didn't inverse this. I would have, but they didn't. So here you kind of think about if I run the 40 a little bit, right? If that 40 time goes up, that actually means that I'm slower. So what would you expect to have happen to the draft position, that Y variable? Yeah, because draft positions, right, start at 1 and then you're right, continue. So actually having a higher draft position is bad. So slower individuals are getting drafted further back. Right? And then we can kind of go through, you know, the rest of this, but the more interesting one is, this has got to be, did they inverse this? I thought they inversed this. Let me double check. Maybe this is just a weird result that they found. This is where sometimes we have to read a little bit more. So if I'm going to go back up here, where was there? So draft position, blah, 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 blah. The model includes, given the base setup. Okay, well, I wouldn't have expected this, but so what they actually found, slightly higher pre-draft ranking. Well, I guess we'll interpret this. I thought that was different. Yeah.
Under the regression line.
Under here or under the thing? To say, I feel like I thought when they're saying inverse, I interpret it as though they were going the opposite direction. So the work with the inverse. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Thank you. That is, I was saying, I thought that's what it was. So I guess the 41 is just not what I expected. This 41 is actually weird, right? I guess unless they inverse the speed as well, so I don't think they did. Actually having faster, these faster 40 times actually made it more likely I was getting drafted sooner, which would kind of go against the kind of counterintuitive. But the other ones kind of make sense, right? If my pre-draft grade is higher, because they've flipped, when they make these inverse, they basically made pick number 1 be pick number whatever hundreds, right? It would be kind of the highest draft pick, right? So now the interpretation is a little bit easier because having a higher number is actually still a good thing. So having a higher pre-draft grade, 1 point higher on this pre-draft grade, would increase your expected draft number by 88 positions. Okay? Scoring 1 point higher on this Wonderlic score, if you're a white athlete, so that beta 1, right, that coefficient we had before, increases your expected draft position by about 1.5 positions, right? 1.47. But then there's an additional effect for kind of black athletes, right? All right. So we have to factor that in. So what they're showing here, although I wouldn't necessarily do this, is they're showing you beta 1 plus beta 3. Right? So remember, before they found that for white athletes, it was just 1.47. The combination of these two things for black athletes was like 0.644. So this Wonderlic test, even if black athletes are performing better on it, isn't impacting their draft position near as much. Right? So we do, and you know, it is significant, right? So we can say there's a significant difference between how these groups are being treated, right? And then if we go down, I believe they run one more regression, right? And they find kind of a similar story, right? They try to break this down by position. And here's something I wanted to point out, which is a good thing to point out about, you know, your projects or really any paper. So they break this down by quarterbacks. Well, here, and it's kind of a more known thing, this Wonderlic test is generally used to evaluate quarterbacks. So notice the change in draft position for quarterbacks much higher from performing 1 point higher in the Wonderlic test than for only offensive line. So here what they did was they basically just kind of like separated out, created different data sets, and then ran those same regressions, right? They found that scoring 1 point higher in that test for quarterbacks increased their draft position by 3 positions sooner, right? But only about 1 for the line. Now, when they separated this out, you know, white versus black players, this is still positive, right? We had it was positive before and there was a significant difference, but our significances went away. But one thing to point out, and they don't show you the p-values here, they're giving you kind of standard errors. So just as a aside, and this is a little bit of more regression review than we probably had done recently, but I think that it's worthwhile. So we've always kind of said, like, we're determining this significance if our p-value is less than alpha, right? But where does that p-value really come from? That p-value, remember, we're always starting out assuming that these slopes are equal to 0, right? That there's no relationship between our x and y variable. We're going to find some sample evidence, and it's going to equate to some test statistic. We would then look for the area to the right. It's a two-tailed test, so it was equally likely we saw something on the other side. We multiply it by 2, and that's our p-value, right? So this test statistic is going to be directly linked to our p-value, right? As the test statistic gets higher, right, as we are a higher number of standard deviations away from that assumed true difference of, or sorry, assumed true relationship of 0, our p-value is going to be getting smaller. Means we're going to be more likely to reject, right? More likely we can say that there is a relationship. So here we can kind of figure out what our test statistic is. I think it was something like 2.4 was our estimate. So our test statistic is the estimate divided by our standard error. Generally, our standard errors will be shown right below the estimate. So here, this is going to be what? 1.6-ish. So some of our cutoff values, like for significance, are 1.65. This is really close, right? Now, unless if we have the actual Excel output, which is like what I would give you maybe on the exam, you know, you might see these p-values like here, maybe it was 0.12, right? Well, okay, a p-value of 0.12 is not less than 1, so I can't say it's significant, but I can't say it's significant at the 90% level, but I could say it's significant at like the 87, because that would make my p-value 0.13. What's the difference between 87 and 90% confidence? I don't know, right? Not a lot, right? It's just that we set this benchmark, so it's kind of arbitrary. I mean, it is important to have benchmarks, don't get me wrong, but it is a little bit like we shouldn't just be throwing this result away. Like it's very close to being able to say like we found a significant relationship. So even though they didn't find significance on this interaction term here, still pretty strong evidence that black quarterbacks, white quarterbacks' performance on this Wonderlic test are being kind of weighted differently, right? That black quarterbacks, if they perform better on this test, even greater of kind of an impact on their draft position. And then they broke this down here. I think none of these are significant, although same kind of story. These are really close. Like if you actually work out what these t values and p values are, these are very, very close to significant, just not quite at our benchmark values. And then this one I was really shocked by, but like apparently for tight ends, like black tight ends are being treated very differently when it comes to their Wonderlic score as opposed to white tight ends. Yeah, just, you know, this isn't good, right? This is evidence that there might be some discriminatory practices going on, or at the very least, they're evaluating kind of these black and white players differently. Questions kind of over or anything there? Just kind of bringing up some linear regression stuff, kind of some evidence of discrimination, because I wanted to also go through the very first, let's see, I want to zoom in a little bit. This first problem, because I know it sometimes can be tougher. So let's say we've got this combination, right? So this was the week where I kind of filmed things, so I want to make sure we have some kind of going over more of these discrimination models. So problem one of the last homework set, assume that you've got employer discrimination against Hispanic players, but only exists in smaller cities, right? So we've got the same supply of Hispanic and non-Hispanic players. So I might change something up as we work through this that wasn't on the homework to show you how we could even complicate this further. But we want to compare the equilibrium wage and the number of Hispanic players on large versus small market teams, right? So here, we're holding kind of the quality of the player constant, right? We're just thinking about how does the role of large and small markets and then this practice of discrimination impact the wages we would expect to see. So initially what I would do is start out drawing what we would expect the differences to be between the large and small markets. We kind of said the supply of labor is going to be consistent no matter what. So Hispanic, we'll kind of say H, and H would be non-Hispanic players. So I've got the same supply of both groups. If I drew my demand curve for labor for these small market teams, and actually here, I'm going to write small market. I'm going to use my subscript. We know this is the demand for labor. So for my small market, where would be my demand for labor for my large market teams? Yeah, higher, right? Well, why? Because I know that the demand for labor is the marginal revenue per win times the marginal wins that come from that labor. So we're kind of looking at the same quality players. We're just thinking about how does large, small market influence it and how does this discrimination influence it? Well, larger markets have a higher marginal revenue per win. This is something we've talked about in the past. That's why they can target a higher number of wins, etc. So we've got, I'm going to draw this really extreme to start out, right? A really high demand for labor, right? Now, this should be what the labor is in both areas for non-Hispanic players, because that's the group that is never being discriminated against in this scenario, right? We said that only small market teams were discriminating against Hispanic players. So just the large and small market differences without any discrimination, here we can kind of expect, well, here's the wage for our non-Hispanic players on a small market team. Here's the wage for our non-Hispanic players on a large market team. And we could identify same kind of thing for what that equilibrium quantity would be as well. Okay. Any questions up to that point? So here, this is just differences in the group that's not being discriminated against. We don't have to worry about discrimination here. This is really just highlighting, even if we're not worried about discrimination, small market teams, no matter what group we're looking at, going to be able to pay lower, or an equilibrium, we're paying lower wages in these large market teams. Because that same quality player has a higher valuation than that large market team. Okay. Excuse me. From there, I need a different color. Let's think about discrimination from these small market teams. I think that's what it said. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so small market teams discriminate. So what's going to change in this model? My employers are discriminating. So if I'm thinking about this demand curve for labor, and let's say we look at the small market team, here's the value of that player to the small market team. But if that player is Hispanic and those teams are discriminatory, there's this additional cost to having them, employing them on the team. So the actual value of that player is going to go down, right, to the owner or who, the employer, whoever we're thinking about. So my demand curve for labor, I should see for my Hispanic players is actually lower, right, for those small market teams. So what's that going to do? Well, if I think about where would this be for my large market? Well, they don't discriminate, right? So the demand curve for Hispanic players is the exact same as the demand curve for non. It's not going to be any different, right? So all this is going to do, if you have your smaller market teams discriminating, it's just going to cause wider gaps in kind of the wages that they would offer the same quality player for a large and a small market team. It's also going to then result in a larger gap between the number of Hispanic players we see in small market versus large market teams, right? And I don't think this is like the wildest assumption that, possibly a lot of smaller markets, might be in areas that tend to be a little more discriminatory, right? Maybe, I don't think it's far-fetched to argue that Oklahoma City may not be, quite as, might be a little more discriminatory towards certain groups than, places that are really diverse, like New York City or Boston or all these other areas, right? I don't know, maybe I'm picking on Oklahoma City, but maybe that's my bias, right? But I would imagine, some of these smaller markets, we don't see as much, diversity when it comes to race in these smaller markets. This is a pretty reasonable thing that would point that, yeah, small markets, not only are they originally going to have a hard time because they just generate less revenue, if they're discriminatory, they're going to make it even harder for themselves to compete, right? Because now every single player of whatever quality this is, given the option, or if they have two teams, a large and small market team offering them a wage, they're always going to choose that larger market team, right? Just causing kind of some of these groups who are being discriminated against to end up on these larger market teams who already have this advantage from being a large market team. Any questions on that? Okay, so we're going to do the exact same thing. I think this is either B or C. And I'll go through this quick. And basically, well, I don't know if I want to complicate this too much, but I've got colors here and you can see it, so it shouldn't be too bad. So instead of redrawing all of this and just getting rid of the original discrimination, I'll do this in green, right? So let's assume that instead of small market teams being discriminatory, we had large market teams being discriminatory. We can kind of result in two things, right? So the first is, let's say they're not that discriminatory, right? So kind of see here, if they had a small taste for discrimination, they'd still be willing to pay a higher wage than these small market teams, even if the small market teams weren't discriminatory now. And they would employ a higher number, right? So this is where it gets kind of weird because we can't see a lot of the times like every individual player's supply and every individual team's demand curve necessarily in every contract negotiation. A lot of times what people look for is they're looking at the statistics that exist, like the number of players, right? Or the wages that are being paid to players. So that's generally all we see in the data. So with this discrimination, it's going to look like we still see more Hispanic players in these large market teams. So that's what we would expect, right? So, okay, no discrimination. Well, no, it's not as high as it should be, right? Even though it's higher, we can't really disentangle. Well, it might just be higher because it's a large market team. They could still be discriminatory and still end up paying that group they're being discriminatory against a higher wage. So a lot of times discrimination, if it's occurring from someone who already has an advantage in terms of revenue generation, like a larger market team, or when we say large market, right? This could be higher fan base, maybe they just have higher relative performance recently, so higher quality, so they're generating more revenue. It's still, they could just be masking the discrimination. Okay? Now, if it got great enough, right? And let's say like push discrimination all the way down here. Well, now we start to get wages that are below the small market, right? And that can actually, if we had large market teams being discriminatory, I want to say it's a good thing, but it would be a good thing for what? Competitive balance, right? And so it'd be one way to kind of equal out. And also, if they were that discriminatory, without the existence of a small market team, that discriminated against group would always get this, these lower wages. At least the small markets, right? If they're non-discriminatory, at least we have that option for that discriminated group to kind of earn somewhat higher wages, even though they're not being given the opportunity to earn the wages that they should be paid on these larger market teams. Questions on that idea? So I'm going to do something else because somebody asked a question about it after class. And it does somewhat relate to this idea. And I didn't ask this on the homework, but it could be something I ask on the exam. So let's say we've got the demand coming from small market team, demand coming from large market team, and the large market team, I want there to be and we'll use we'll just say this is the group they're discriminating against, right? Whatever race, ethnicity, whatever we want this to be. So if I had the same supply of labor, right? Let's say first, this is the supply of labor to the small market team, right? It would be the same as the supply of labor to the large market team. But if I'm playing for an employer who is discriminatory towards me, what might happen to the cost of playing for that team? So if I'm on a small market team, they're treating me well, like I'm, even if I'm getting paid the exact same amount. So even if we kept wages the same, what would be true about the quantity supplied to that small market team relative to the quantity supplied to that large market team? They're treating me like shit every time I show up to work, right? What's it doing to my marginal cost? Increasing it. So what's happening in my supply curve? decreasing, right? If I'm increasing the marginal cost at every single point, I'm getting kind of a higher marginal cost. I've actually got this decrease in my supply curve. So what's kind of interesting is if we didn't have workers reacting, then yeah, they are going to be willing, on these large market teams, they'll be willing to accept these lower wages, and we see fewer of them on that team. But if they respond with providing less labor, right, they won't accept these lower wages. Notice now, in order to end up on a large market team, the large market team is going to have to offer them a higher wage, right? Than if the employees weren't kind of fighting back, so to speak, or weren't caring about discrimination. Now, the quantity also goes down, right? It's also we see fewer of those players because now not only do the teams want fewer of that player because they're discriminated against, but now fewer of the players are going to want to play for that discriminatory team, right? So it just kind of exacerbates kind of this quantity issue, but it does result in, if we look here, it almost results in the wages that those players should get paid, right? Or it could. I drew the shift so that it did exactly, right? If it shifted even more, you could even end up with, well, the players that actually end up on these large market teams, if they're being in that discriminatory group, basically all the players kind of drop out. You only end up with the highest quality players. They're earning higher wages than they would have before, but a lot fewer of them have those positions, right? It's kind of like the idea of a minimum wage, in the sense that, yeah, if you keep your job and get this higher wage, right, if the shift kind of continue to go up, well, great. Even this discrimination might result in the people who keep their jobs in these large markets actually earning higher wages, but it's going to result in a lot fewer people even having those opportunities, right? So there's always trade-offs, right? I heard someone, there's a Thomas Sowell's line is there's no solutions in life. There's only trade-offs, right? So, right, we're going to gain possibly that. Yeah, if the employees fight back and they're discriminatory as well because they're being discriminated against, raising that supply curve, they can kind of combat some of these effects, increase their wages back to where they should be, but we're going to end up with a lot fewer people actually getting opportunities on those large markets. Questions on that point? And so I'm going out on a limb here a little bit. So what I'm about to say is not fact. This is my interpretation of the world, right? But this basic model suggests something like, if we believe Black quarterbacks are in any way, and it doesn't have to be employer discrimination, it could be consumer markets, right? We said consumer discrimination works in the same way. It's just lowering the marginal revenue per win. So even if we have the consumer or employer discrimination, if these players are kind of fighting back with them not wanting to play in those markets, so I'm a Black quarterback and there's markets that in a large measure are discriminatory towards me, or those teams are discriminatory, well, we might see fewer Black quarterbacks in these larger market teams, but the ones that do end up on those teams pay significantly higher wages, right? And, so maybe if you're thinking about average middle of the road quarterbacks, you're not going to start to see near as many of them get opportunities or get as long or length of an opportunities, right? We can complicate the quantity of labor. It's not just the number of games. This could be the length of time a team is willing to allow that quarterback to play, right? It might be a little bit quicker to pull them or kind of replace them. Now that's kind of what I would compare to. I don't know if discrimination is going on in these large markets, but that kind of matches up with what we see, I think, to some degree. And that's just from a very basic kind of model, right?
Pretty much exactly what happened with Colin Kaepernick.
Yeah, right. As soon as there's a slight increased cost to having, yeah. Like I said, can't use one example, but right across all that, I would say that kind of matches up with what we see. Could be somewhere not even the players. So this model would also apply exactly to coaching as well, right? So the idea, if you do have Black coaches that are being discriminated in any way against. So we looked at that with one paper, maybe head coaches aren't, but maybe the coordinators are, right? So this could be the coordinator market. You might see fewer Black coaches being given coordinator positions, but the ones that do kind of rise to prominence, right? They're paid very well, the teams highly value them, but even when they highly value them, they shouldn't be, they're still undervaluing them, right? So we might see the Black offensive, defensive coordinators who are given opportunities and long opportunities, they're gonna be the idea that they're gonna be higher quality, they can earn higher wages. We're losing a lot of opportunities for those coaches that should have been given those opportunities, right? If it's discrimination occurred. Any other questions on that for community? Not trying to like get on a soapbox or anything, but this stuff is interesting, right? Because you can kind of see it play out. So the other thing I wanted to try to go through today, I think we'll have enough time. I'll actually stay here. So it was a question somebody asked last class, and it's somewhat related to things we talked about, and I don't know, I think it's interesting to think about. So I was thinking about this a little bit today as well. So if we've got, let's say, well, we don't even need this model. Let's say we've got two teams, right? So team 1, team 2. And team 1 values the first pick in the draft, right? And, you know, if they added the player that they're planning on drafting, let's just say that player has a value, the marginal wins per labor of 30 million, right? Team 2 doesn't have that first round pick. So let's say team 1 owns pick 1 and has a valuation of that pick that they believe the player they're going to add has a value to their team of 30 million. Team 2 says, look, if I could get that second pick, the value of it to me would be 35 million, right? So under this model, team 1 would be willing to trade that pick if offered anything over 30 million. And when I say offer, this could be a combination of players that they might get traded, other draft picks and the value of those draft picks, right? Or a combination of the two. So here, team 1 willing to accept anything over whatever they currently value having that pick as. Right? So hopefully this is going to connect a bunch of things we talked about. Team 2, if they would value at 35, they'd be willing to trade anything up to 35 million, right? They're not going to give a value of 36 because then they would have kind of a net loss there, right? But if they value that pick at 35, if they give up something worth 32 million, they're still having a net benefit of 3 million, right? So they'd be willing to give up a trade package that had a worth to them of anything less than 35 million. So we know that there's a possibility that we see a trade happen here, right? So if this was the case, right, we don't know exactly where it's going to be, but we would expect there could be a trade occurring so that the team that values it the most, values that number 1 pick the most, will always be the team that ends up with the pick, right? As long as they're the one that values the most, we'll always have some contract zone where negotiation could occur. Okay? So this is called, remember what that was called? Whoever has the highest marginal benefit to possession of a good will end up having the rights to that good. Here, the good is draft picks, invariance principle, or I think Coates theorem is another kind of term that is used for it. But this is, lines up exactly with what our contract zone would say too. Now, what can get a little bit trickier is, and we see this. I'm really bad at. I try to not follow because there's just too much, and I don't care. Well, I mean, I don't care until the day of. Like their picks are going to be what they are the night of the draft, right? But someone, the Panthers traded for the number 1 pick this year. Is that right? No. Yes. Okay.
They traded us in front of the Colts.
Okay, so they traded up, right? So why do they do that? They valued that first pick more than the team that had it, right? I just read something this morning. Someone's gonna, I think we have time to this. Someone is gonna trade up for Jalen Carter, and I can't remember the team now. What pick did the Bears have? Bert?
I think they traded back to 9.
We're trading 9. Okay, so I heard something about they were going to trade up, right? So Jalen Carter, if you're not aware, has gotten in some trouble with the law, right? And so, maybe every other team, the valuation fell. So if every other team's valuation fell, no matter what pick I have, if there's a team that doesn't care about the trouble with the law, their value of Jalen Carter is going to be way, way higher, right? So that team that doesn't care about his troubled loss it was the Steelers. Now that I remember that, it was so they might be willing to trade way up because every other team's valuation fell, so that their valuation of those higher picks, because they think they can get that one player that everybody is kind of undervaluing, went way, way up, right? So, that's kind of a unique example where, and I'm assuming that if they are willing to trade up, it's that they didn't lower their expectation of this player by that much because they got in trouble with the law, right? But back to this example, another thing that might be interesting is, okay, here's this valuation, right? And I don't know where I'm going to get in this contract zone, right? Maybe they go back and forth and they're offering trade packages worth this much or that much. What could cause us to know what end we're going to get closer to? So let's say there's a third team, and this is the value of their, I put pick 1 here, sorry, pick 2. This is the value that they have to having that first pick, right? So now there's 2 teams that value that player at 35. So if team 3 goes to team 1 and says, look, we'll give you a trade value worth $30.5 million. What does team 2 do? They go to team 1 and say, we'll give you a trade value worth $31 million. And what does team 3 do? We'll give you a valuation worth 31 point, right? They were competing against each other. So if you can be the team at the top that has a lower valuation of that pick, and there's at least 2 other teams who have higher valuations than you, they're always going to compete that up to the higher end of that contract zone, which is good for you, right? Because now when I trade this, I potentially, something I value at 30 million, I'm getting 35 million worth back in return, right? Now, does that make sense? Any questions on that idea? So as long as you have.
Yeah, can other teams legally know what other teams are offering for that?
I mean,
Or
I'm pretty sure that if it's not like it's made public, but if team 3 offers team 1 something, then team 2 comes to talk to them, there's nothing that's preventing them from being like, oh, so-and-so was willing to give us X, Y, and Z, right? There's no confidentiality. At least I'm not aware that there's any confidentiality until maybe an agreement is signed, you could build it into a contract, but this is just talk, right? And honestly, you could lie. I don't think there's nothing preventing them from saying, yeah, we got other teams and they're, I could make you believe that there's competition when there actually isn't, right? I would imagine that's not something that has never occurred, right? That's got to be something that these teams have done. Now, these other teams, if they're doing their due diligence, probably can talk to some other organizations and see, well, is this actually happening or not? But let's assume that there are 2. I mean, it doesn't even have to be, I couldn't even have to tell you that, right? So if they think about like the first pick in the draft, and let's say the team that had it was the Bears, right? Traded away. They already have a quarterback that everyone they kind of knows they're going to go with. The real value in that first pick is quarterbacks have the highest marginal wins per labor. So I know that teams that don't have good starting quarterbacks are going to value that pick a lot more. So I don't have to really talk to anybody to look out and be like, yeah, I don't think Davis Mills is cutting in Houston, right? Like I don't think, Like I can kind of identify that there are multiple teams who are going to value that. Now, I might not be able to know exactly how much, but I know that we're going to be able to compete up to kind of the higher range of the negotiation contract zone. Does that make sense? So that's if I have 2 teams there. What if I've got, let's say, well, I'll leave it there. I don't want to complicate it too much. You could also have the flip side where let's say you want to start comparing like the first 2 picks and you have 2 teams that don't value it much. Then you might end up getting, kind of bargaining towards the lower end of the contract zone. That's probably not as happen as often as realistic, but this idea, as long as you get 2 teams competing with each other, we not only have this contract zone, we probably can say the end result is going to be a little bit to the higher end of that contract zone. Other questions on that before we keep moving? Yeah.
Wouldn't the lower end literally be Lamar Jackson's situation right now?
Yeah, right. So my imagination with Lamar Jackson, well, yeah, my imagination is this is going on, right? You actually have slightly different because we're not talking about the draft picks, but you could think about you could either analyze his relationship with the Ravens or his current offer. So if the Ravens only value him, sorry, I went the backwards way. If the Ravens only value him by I want to think about this as this is what I think is happening. So the Ravens have said, or Lamar has said, he values himself at what was Deshaun Watson's contract? 231. Right? Like he values him like as 1 million more. He wants to be the top pick. So he's willing to accept anything in this range. Right. What I think is going on is the Ravens, I don't know what the number is, but they don't value him that much. Right. Otherwise, if they did, they'd come up with an agreement, right? It might, and at this point, Lamar said he'll take this, so we know his lower bound, right? We know where that's at. I could offer them that. He's been very transparent, which is terrible, right? Which is why he probably needs an agent, right? Like you shouldn't tell the other side, I'd do 231, or I'd write that. Well, you probably would like to have 235 if the team would have offered you 280, right? So it's like there's a terrible strategy. Anyways, so we know that if the Ravens aren't willing to give him that, it's got to be. He's already told you his lowest bound. They have to believe they don't value him. They just don't. Right? Otherwise, they'd give him that offer. What Lamar believes is that not only is there someone who would give him 231 million, he thinks there's other teams out there who value him at something higher than that. Right? If there were other teams that valued him at something higher than that, they could offer the Ravens anything in this range, right? The Ravens would be willing to take a trade package, anything above whatever this value they have for Lamar is. So they take this, they take this, they take this, they take this. Any trade package in this range would be so you almost have like two contract zones, right? Between Lamar and the Ravens, between the Ravens and other teams, right? Trading away Lamar. So it has to be that there's not a team that really values him in this range. If there was, the Ravens would be willing to trade with that team. That team would be willing to give up that much in assets, and however much they're giving, that's the value that Lamar would want, right? Now, I don't know. Maybe there's some more complicated things going on behind the scenes than I realize, but this is, if there was a team that valued him higher than what he's willing to offer, the Ravens would be more than okay trading away that pick. So that tells me that there's at least no other team who has put together a trade package that would be something that's acceptable to Lamar. Right? Yeah.
Not that this is to scale or anything, but the trade realistically would probably be in between where the Ravens are and where Lamar is, because Lamar, so willingly told his bottom line.
Yeah, so you would
know the Ravens aren't paying that.
So you could almost, you're right. You could actually say you don't believe there's a team that values him more than 231, right? So this, there isn't a team here. There is maybe a team here. So there could be, if Lamar lowered his expectations a little, you could even have a range here where you could see a trade. But because he set that hard and fast lower bound, we know that there's likely no team above that, right? Now, the only caveat to this is one thing we talked about that does kind of break down with this idea of like the invariance principle would be what? Not only if I have to give up a certain amount of money, but if there's any type of transaction cost, right? So if I'm trading and I have to give up not only this much, but I also have to give up draft picks, which I value, well, then that's going to take, I'd be willing to pay 250, but now I have to give up a draft pick I value 30 million. That's going to send my contract zone way to the left. All right. So we'll pick up. I'll have some more of the questions that were asked last week. We'll kind of go over those on Wednesday, maybe bring up one additional paper. If you have any questions as you're kind of looking at that next fifth homework, if you want to work on that, let me know. On your project, office hours 2 to 4, Monday, Wednesday, Thursday. Okay. All right. See you guys on Wednesday.